Hello, and welcome back to Take It or Leave It Commentaries. Today, we're going to be continuing our look at the pilot series for Dallas, the first 5 episodes. We're up to episode 3, Spy in the House, at this point. If you would like to follow along with me, I'm watching this on Amazon Prime. So if you have the series on Amazon or if you have your own copy and would like to follow along, you can press play now. And here, of course, we have the opening credits. It's the same opening credits for the other episodes of the pilot season here. It's basically the same that we eventually came to expect from Dallas, with a few minor changes and one big change, which is seeing the box ranch at the end instead of Duncan Acres, which eventually became legally known as South Fork. But except for some cast omissions, like the absence of Linda Gray and Ken Kirchable, the opening credits are pretty much the same. They did change the opening later in Dallas. I think when there were about 2 or 3 seasons left. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, and changed it pretty dramatically. I'm not sure why they did that at that point. I guess just to try to jazz it up and maybe generate some interest. But it basically stayed pretty much the same for most of the series. There, of course, is the box ranch, like we've talked about before. I mentioned in our last commentary about Dallas that episode 2 was probably the most different from what Dallas eventually became as any of the other of these early episodes. And I think this episode is probably the most similar to what Dallas would become. Episode 2 was different in that it focused on Pam, focused a lot on Lucy and their relationship, and barely featured JR at all. Sue Ellen only had a few minor lines of dialogue. This episode, unlike episode 2, is focuses um, fairly heavily on JR and gives you some background into his story, kind of like episode 2 did with Lucy. Gives you some information about his marriage with Sue Ellen, and it's heavily focused on the business of Ewing Oil and the rivalry with Cliff Barnes. And of course, all of those things were major forces in the storylines of the Dallas series moving forward. And there we get a look at Tina Louise as Julie Gray, and um, that little back and forth with Julie there, I guess, is probably meant to remind the audience that JR and Julie have an ongoing uh, relationship outside of his marriage with Sue Ellen. They make that kind of obvious in the first episode, but it's been a while since the first episode would have aired at this point, so they need to kind of remind the audience of JR and Julie's relationship. And this is obviously being filmed, and as I mentioned before, in a real building somewhere. They didn't have the budget to create a set for this, but I've never heard where or what offices they're using for this. I love that little look that Larry Hagman gives Connie, Bobby's new secretary. He's kind of leering at her in a very lecherous JR type of way, and I'm fairly positive that wasn't scripted. That had to have been added on by Larry Hagman, just like most of JR's trademark personality traits were. I mean, his smile and his kind of chuckle as he's doing what most people would consider some pretty awful things. None of that was written. That was all stuff that Larry Hagman came up with to embellish the character, and a huge part of what made the character eventually become the center of the show. And that little conversation that Julie has there with Bobby um, gives us a little bit more background with her and Jr. and that they were seeing each other even before Jr. and Sue Ellen met and were married. So Julie's been in the picture for quite a while. And here, of course, is Cliff trying to charm Julie into cooperating with him and giving him some dirt on the Ewings. The Cliff Barnes character was very different early on. Of course, he always had his hatred of the Ewings, but he was much more an ethical kind of hero of the everyman figure early on. Later, he became, of course, just as sneaky and just as devious as Jr. If not more so. But at this point, he's still seen as a man of the people and for the people. And this is Jock with one of the state senators that apparently does the Ewing some favors every now and then. If he looks familiar, his name is Norman Alden. He's probably most remembered. Although when I looked him up, he's got tons and tons of credits. He also served in World War II, but he is the owner of the diner in Back to the Future. Um, he's the one that kind of scoffs about the town having a black mayor one day. These are scenes, of course, as we've discussed before, that were filmed at the Aldridge house. And like I said, this is a very heavily business oriented episode. Like a lot of the series was later on, even as this episode opened, um, it opened on the Ewing building, which is the only time that happens during the pilot series. And if you sat down and tried to count how many times an episode opens on the Ewing building itself during the series, you'd be sitting down for a long time. And it's also indicative of how different the show became in that, like we discussed in episode 2, they focused on Lucy and more of her backstory and her relationship with Pam. It's not until episode 3 that we delve more into the character of Jr. and get into an episode that's focused on some business and scandal at Ewing Oil. If they had had any idea, of course, what the series would eventually become, Jr. would have been the focus of the very first episode, and they would have instantly gotten into some Ewing oil business. And this is actually uh, the last time you'll see a heavy focus on business during the pilot series. It's kind of this episode and this episode only. They do get into a little bit of the Ewing oil um, issues with Cliff Barnes and the investigating committee in the very first episode, but that's really just kind of to set up why the family has so much money. This is the only episode that gets into anything like that in any detail. And there we get a good look at Jock not being completely ruthless, but actually trying to help the senator who's helped him. And here's our first look at Pam actually in this episode. Victoria Principal's look, and I know I've discussed this before, changed dramatically as the show went on. She she definitely got much thinner. Although here it's not as if she has any pounds, in my opinion, that she needs to lose. But she just has much more of a natural look here, and that changed pretty quickly as the series went on, which is a shame. Not that she didn't remain attractive for a lot of the series, she did, um, but it was just a very different look. And look at that red station wagon with the wow with the brown. That is heavily late 70s or even mid 70s, I guess. Wow, that is really dramatic. It's a shame they didn't use the box ranch at some point when it was not winter time. All those kind of empty plants and bushes and trees they have around the ranch. I'm sure that looks amazing in the spring and summer. It would be interesting to see it on film. And as we've discussed before, and you're gonna see some of this as this episode goes on. And in some ways, the box ranch, although it's certainly not as iconic as South Fork or as Duncan Acres, I should say, nowhere near. In many ways, it made more sense the way it's laid out. You also see some dogs around the ranch, which you never saw again. I'm assuming those are the box's own dogs. But here we see that JR and Sue Ellen have their own house on the same property. It looks like it's even maybe connected um, to the house, maybe just connected by a walkway. But at least they've got their kind of own separate quarters, and there's also a side home where in the first episode, JR explains that Gary and Val lived briefly. And I would guess if the series had continued, it probably would have been Bobby and Pam that may have moved into that house. You can see it in the background right there, as a matter of fact. And that really makes more sense instead of all these people living under the same roof. But nevertheless, when the box people decided they did not want the chaos of a film crew around, all of this changed. And my understanding, by the way, is that this is actually the interior of that little side cottage, for lack of a better word, that is on the box ranch. There were only a couple of interiors actually filmed um, at the box ranch, and this is one of them. And here's our first look, really, at JR and Sue Ellen's marriage, and you see that JR's not exactly a caring and supportive husband. In JR's backstory, it's explained that part of his issue with Sue Ellen is that he always considered her a lady, and that affected his vision of her as far as their sex life. He it was almost as if he respected her too much to really let loose um, when it came time to turn off the lights. And in order to kind of get that out of the system is supposedly part of why he turned to two other women, that he just thought Sue Ellen was too much of a lady to have the kind of fun he wanted. Again, when it was time to, you know, turn the lights off again. So I think that's kind of an oversimplification, and they never went into any of that on the show. I think it's more likely that JR turned to other women for one thing for the fun of it, but I think it's just JR's drive for power over all things and all people, and just consuming everything in his sight, and trying to have power over everything in his sight. And the women that he came in contact with were just one more thing for him to control. That's completely my psychological assessment of. I've never heard that from anyone else, but I think that makes the most sense for the character. But here we do get a sense that JR does want something, I don't know, more, I guess, from his partner, or does need something more for his partner, because right after he has that scene with Sue Ellen, he goes right to Julie for really more of an intimate type of um, connection. Here you get the idea that JR simply sees Sue Ellen as what a Mrs. J.R. Ewing is supposed to be, but he just can't connect with her for whatever reason, and it's it's someone like Julie that actually excites him. I'm not. I've never been a huge fan of Tina Louise. I don't think um, she's all that appealing in a, in a sexual way. I mean, maybe it's just that she's not my type, but um, but but obviously Jr. doesn't feel that way, and I guess that's what counts. And Tina Louise kind of eats up the scenery here in a minute. Her acting is a little bit over the top, even for a nighttime soap opera. See, like that. That's And you get the sense too that the fact that she's trying to resist his power and his control just makes him want it more, and that would kind of become a standard for the JR character as the show moved forward. I mean, always wanting someone that doesn't want him, especially when it came to Sue Ellen. And this is going way off track and kind of skipping many years into the future of the series, but I know at one point the character of James Beaumont shows up on the show as JR's unknown long lost son that he apparently had with Vanessa Beaumont, who's this European lady or whatever, and none of that ever made any sense to me. But I did think it would be a good idea for, and I remember thinking this even as a kid watching the show, for for a child of JR's to show up. The show, especially um, especially later on, I think suffered from the fact that there were not any younger characters. I don't mean teenagers. I mean characters in their twenties. Part of that came from the fact that Charlene Tilton just really wasn't able to grow into the role of Lucy, which would have been, I think, an avenue for younger characters to enter the stories. They had a couple of chances to do that again, and fouled it up. Specifically with Jamie Ewing, that could have been another avenue for some younger characters to enter the show, but they badly miscast the role of Jamie Ewing. I think that was based on the fact that they had to find someone that was kind of attractive, but you could also envision marrying Cliff Barnes and all that, and so you couldn't have someone that was too on the ball or too overly attractive, because it just wouldn't make any sense that a really good looking girl in her early to mid 20s would, you know, fall for Cliff Barnes' charm and marry him. I mean, that just, so again, they were kind of limited on casting for that. But if they had brought in a son for JR a little earlier, and if they had cast someone else, I think Sasha Mitchell, as far as I can tell, he does the best he can with what he's given. But that he was horribly miscast as a son for J.R. Ewing. But what they could have done is have someone turn up who claimed actually be Julie Gray's son by JR, and that she had gone away, maybe back to live with her parents or something, gave birth to the child, and then let her parents raise him or gave him up for adoption or whatever, and then have him turn up later on. Again, if JR and Julie have had the lengthy relationship that it shows here, it would have been perfectly conceivable for a kid to show up. I don't know, say season 7 or 8ish, and be in their early 20s to mid 20s, and obviously cast someone else who would actually have fit in with the Ewing family instead of an underwear model. I don't know why in the world they thought that was a good idea. And there we get a little look at a dynamic that would drive much of the stories of the show later on. And you get a sense of the rivalry between JR and Bobby, and JR constantly trying to win his father's approval, and Jock really never giving it to him. Always finding, in my opinion, some fault with something JR said or did when he's only trying to do what Jock has taught him to do. I think in many ways, Jock used JR as his henchman. Taught JR how to do all these devious things, and let him loose to do whatever he needed to do to make Jock happy and to grow the business. And Jock conveniently didn't have to know about the details and could kind of stand back and still be Mr. Respected, and pretend he has nothing to do with it. I think mainly just so he didn't have to hear a sanctimonious lecture from Miss Ellie. But I always thought that was really unfair to Jr. And we also get our first kind of glimpse at Pam being put in the middle of a Barn Ewing battle. Um, Here she brings the file and gives it to Julie, and Julie's about to turn it over to Cliff Barnes, and that puts Pam in the middle of things. And that's another theme that we saw a lot as the series went on. And and you have to admire Victoria Principal as the show evolved and it moved away from Pam being the main character as it was originally envisioned, and I'm sure as it was originally described to her. As far as I know, and I've never heard anyone say anything different, she did not protest. She didn't pitch a fit. She didn't demand that she remain the center of the show. she didn't threaten to leave, or again, if she did any of that, I've never heard of it. She was fine to do what was best for the show, and that was to make Jr. the center of things and to have her one of the characters that was always reacting to whatever Jr. had going on. She was still a major character on a huge series at the time, so it worked for her benefit too. It wasn't something she did just completely out of the goodness of her heart, but she could have made things very difficult, and from everything I've ever heard, she didn't. And one more thing that would become a very common theme on the show is JR and Cliff sharing the same bed partner. I mean, you could make a very long list of the number of women that JR and Cliff had in common. Julie, of course, here, Sue Ellen, Afton, Mandy. I'm sure I'm leaving some out there. I believe Tina Louise is still alive, by the way. I intended to look up some information. She's mainly known, of course, for being Ginger on Gilligan's Island. But I'm pretty sure she's still alive. If she has passed away, it's been recently. It's a little vague exactly what this investigative committee that Cliff, um, where Cliff is the attorney for the investigating senators. What exactly this group is investigating, and how long this is supposed to be going on? I mean, apparently they're looking into corruption concerning the oil business and politicians. It's a little odd that politicians would be investigating themselves, because you would think every state senator in the state of Texas would certainly have something to do with the oil business. But that's kind of left kind of vague, and why they can't just have Cliff Barnes thrown off the committee. This is the best scene of this episode, in my opinion. One of the best of the pilot series, as a matter of fact. For one thing, it's very similar to many scenes in the rest of the series. A big conflict at South Fork, around the dinner table. See, look at Victoria Principal there. She looks great. It's unfortunate that later on she tried to change her look so dramatically. Well, not tried to, did. And this is the dining room again at the Aldridge house, just like the rest of the South Fork interiors. I'm not talking as much because I'm getting caught up in the scene. This really is a good scene. There's a lot of the foundation gets laid for a lot of what's to come, especially with Jock and Ellie looking on as Bobby and Jr. kind of fight it out about something. I also noticed right before they cut back to the scene, throughout the throughout the pilot series, when they have an establishing shot of the box ranch, it's always from the side. And I understand it shows everyone's cars there, and that's apparently the entrance that people mainly use coming and going. But it's a lot more impressive looking house when you show it from the front. And so I don't know why they didn't use some establishing shots of the box ranch from the front. It's just kind of an odd choice. Even here, why wouldn't they have shot this on the front porch of the box ranch? With those big, huge columns and and looking really impressive instead of just here by this little brick wall. It's Now I don't buy that for a second, Pam. I hate coming between you and your family. She at times later in the series she seems to go out of her way to come between him and the family. So there's something about it she likes. And Bobby right there is really almost naively loyal. The only explanation at this point that makes any sense is that Pam took the file. It's kind of a convoluted set of circumstances that she had to bring it to the office and then Julie had it and all that. It makes a lot more sense that Pam either gave it to Cliff or he took it from her. And Cliff using that typewriter, that is every time I see a typewriter now, it reminds me of a time long, long gone. I guess if you were an expert, I've been to Dallas, but I'm certainly no expert on the downtown layout. But if you really did know a lot about Dallas's downtown, it could pick out buildings and what you could see from different ways. You could actually figure out where they're filming this. That's a pretty distinctive structure there out the window. But like, wow, that is a heck of a couch he's sitting on. And look, that couch matches those curtains. That's aggressively 70s. but but again, I'm not familiar enough with Dallas to pick out where that might be, or even if that building's still there. You would think it is. It's obviously a skyscraper, but oh, and here comes Bobby wearing Richie April's leather jacket that he took off Rocky DeMan. You get an extra point, by the way, if you get that reference. And him with the fur, the state senator with the fur lined coat, that is something too. I don't really understand what good this does the Ewings for the state senator to retire and for him to be able to keep the house and all that. This is this is not really the Ewing's problem. Um, it's more of the state senator's problem. So if he's going to try to hang on and then lose in the next election or even go to jail, so be it. But and it's also not exactly clear that he's done anything for them that's illegal. So I don't understand what good this does anyone. I mean, I guess it's just a convenient plot point to show that this friend of the Ewings is going to lose his state senate seat and all that. But again, in reality, as a political problem, this doesn't seem to be Bobby's or Jock's or JR's issue. Another thing too about that kind of goes back to what I said a second ago. In Texas, especially at the time, every state senator in the legislature just about would have some sort of ties to the oil business in some way. So if they're going to start kicking people out of the legislature because they seem to be doing favors for the oil business, I mean they're not going to have anybody left in the legislature. So I don't really. Again, this is all kind of vague. And I had a couple of comments by the way that said I was being harsh on some of the actresses that are in Dallas, specifically Charlene Tilton, and I think there was another kind of co-star and Victoria Principal and all that. But it just not trying to be harsh on them. I'm just just giving my opinions, obviously. But the same here with Julie Gray. I, I just think they could have done a better job of casting someone that was just very, very attractive. For whatever reason, I keep thinking of there's a not that I'm saying they should cast her, but I'm just explaining the difference. There was a girl that showed up, and I can't remember her name off the top of my head. Right before Jr. hires Sly, he's fired Luella and he needs to hire a new secretary. And there's a girl that comes in that kind of offers herself to Jr. and she's incredibly attractive. Um, Someone like that for this part, again, not that actress specifically, but someone along those same lines, I think would just have had a larger impact. Oh, Pam's had a hairdo since the last time we saw her. That's an interesting scene too, where they make it clear that Bobby and presumably Jock know about JR's extramarital activities, at least when it comes to Julie, and they kind of turn the other way, which of course is another reason I'm sure that JR continues to do it. I mean, it's human nature to continue to do something you like to do when there's no consequences. By the way, Bobby's secretary, I don't think I mentioned this, that JR is kind of leering at earlier in the episode. Her name is also Connie. And it's not clear. It's not the same actress that plays the Connie later in the series, and it's not exactly clear if it's just a coincidence that they have the same name or if it's supposed to be the same Connie. I I guess it's supposed to be the same Connie, but I'm not sure why they recast the role. But look at Cliff's stereo; that was top of the line at the time. This is a good glimpse of Cliff's real motivations. It's not about his high-handed morals and ethics. It's about getting the Ewings. Although they kind of sweep this under the rug when they get into the regular series because Cliff is back to being, a very respected and responsible politician. But this is a really a good look at what he's really all about. It's interesting. He's got a picture of Digger there. That makes sense. Of course, it's like a 8 by 10 glossy shot of. I mean, I don't. I've always wondered that about TV series about why they can't actually just take the time to take a couple of candid looking pictures of people instead of having like their 8 by 10 that's part of their portfolio uh, sitting in a picture frame somewhere. That's just it just seems so lazy and ridiculous. Who has a black and white 8 by 10 of someone sitting around somewhere, especially a close up of their face? I couldn't. Can you just take a couple of Polaroids or something? I don't understand. Those are very 70s apartments and homes behind them there. Wow. They actually look similar a little bit to they're supposed to be apartments. I don't know if they're actually apartments in real life or if they're homes. Maybe it's a combination of both, but they kind of look like the neighborhood from Poltergeist. This scene is interesting for a couple of different reasons, but mainly because JR is reacting here. Later when JR becomes kind of the focus of the show, he's the active one. He's the one doing all the things that other people react to. In this scene, and really for much of this episode, he's much more reactive because again, he's not the he's not the main character of the show. So other people are doing things that he then plays off of. But that's a very Dallas scene right there between, or at least the way it ends between Jr. and Bobby. Jr. not throwing Jr. to the wolves when he could, and even though Jr.'s already done the same thing to him. The way that plays out right there too between Jr. and Julie, it does demonstrate that Jr. cares for. And there's a little bit different view of the box ranch where you see the front. This scene here, and again, it's very similar to the way a lot of scenes would play out in the series. Lucy's line right there is pretty good, but Jr. to me seems genuinely apologetic here, and I'm not sure if that's just because they don't have the figure of the excuse me the character fully rounded out yet, or or if he's trying to pretend that he's sorry. But I don't get that. I truly think he seems as if he's sorry for accusing Pam and sorry for the way things worked out. And this ending scene is a good one of Jr. just kind of looking at Pam. If anything, even though Jr. does truly seem apologetic, but almost two rivals looking at each other as if the rivalry has really just begun. That's probably me overthinking it like I do most of the things with this series, but that's the way I see it. And look at those old pictures of Dallas. Wow. Um, like I said, I went to visited Dallas recently, and those strips of land you see here as this is going off are not empty strips of land anymore. Dallas is a huge city that, for all I can tell, is still booming as much as it ever did. It's really a tangled super metropolis. It is a really busy place, but it's a lot of fun, a lot of stuff to see, a lot of good restaurants. We really enjoyed our trip to Dallas, and I had never seen the Texas School Book Depository before, and I've always been interested in the JFK assassination, so I wanted to check that out, and of course went to South Fork and had a really good time. But that's all for today. I'm going to continue with the Dallas commentaries at least through the 5 episodes of the pilot season here, or the pilot miniseries, whatever you want to call it, and then maybe take a break from that for a while and take a look at something else. If you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time. Thanks.